For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Strat News Global and welcome to The Gist, our signature show on foreign policy, security, trade, technology, and a lot else. I'm Surya Gangadharan and I'd like to welcome our guest for this evening's show, Mythili Bhusnurmath, a frequent writer on the economy. She is a consulting editor for the Economic Times, and we're going to talk to her about the recently concluded G20 Summit, where there was a fairly big ticket announcement, so I'm told, on a minimum corporate tax for companies. Now, Mythili, just what is this minimum corporate tax? Is this a big deal?
Well, you called it a big ticket item, Surya, and I think for this to understand how big a ticket it is really, one must go back a little, in fact, go back a couple of decades, I would say, to what the work that the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an intergovernmental economic organization with about 38 member countries, which was founded in 1961, basically to promote global cooperation, stimulate economic progress, etc. They have been working on something known as, base erosion and profit shifting. And they had set up something known as the Financial Action Task Force. And the whole idea was to ensure that large multinational companies did not take advantage of the advances in technology to shift the base, as it were, of their operations. In theory, the base continued to be in different countries. But what happened is because of the advances in technology, they were able to book their profits in jurisdictions which had very low rate of corporate tax. So because of this, you had two problems. One was that countries did not legitimately get the tax revenue that is due to them, because here were companies functioning in their jurisdiction, but because they were able to transfer the profits elsewhere, they were not getting the tax revenues that were due to them. On the other hand, we saw this race to the bottom, a competition amongst countries to keep progressively lowering their corporate tax in order to induce companies to come and book the profits in their jurisdictions. So this race to the bottom, and this effect of base shifting and base erosion and profit shifting, the OECD under the FATF had been trying to do something about it to correct these kind of anomalies. And needless to say, it was an uphill task. But finally, in July this year, the OECD announced that they've got some kind of an agreement amongst the various countries to end this practice. And what was the practice that they said? They said that there would be a new minimum tax rate of 15% that would apply to companies with an annual revenue of more than 866 million US dollars. And this was hoped would generate around 150 billion in additional global tax revenues. And this additional revenue would be shared amongst the different countries in the world. So the OECD was very happy with this announcement. It was a landmark announcement. Remind you, I'm repeating the one announcement because there's a lot of difference and a lot of space and a distance between making an announcement and actually seeing it being implemented. But the very fact that we were able to make an announcement itself was a very significant deal. Following that, in October this year, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, they have a meeting. So there they endorsed this minimum global tax agreement, corporate tax agreement that the OECD had really initiated and seen to fruition. So this was described in various ways. Everybody went quite gaga about it and they said, oh, this is really landmark, this is really historic, etc., etc. And the final seal of approval of this tax agreement was to be done in Rome, where we saw the G20 Summit meeting, where the global leaders of the G20 met and gave their final seal of approval to this corporate minimum tax. The G20, as we all know, is a forum covering a large part of the world as well as the populations of the world. So it's a forum covering 60% of the world population, 80% of the world GDP. So effectively, it covers most of the world in terms of both population as well as certainly in terms of GDP. So at the weekend we just concluded, we saw these global leaders coming and finally signing onto this agreement, which specifies, as I said, a minimum rate of corporate tax of 15%. And at the same time, they said that the tax will have to be distributed amongst different countries. Countries will no longer be able to evade tax, saying that, look, we don't have a base there. If you are doing business, say, in a country like India, regardless of where you book your profits, could be in Ireland, could be in some tax haven, you would have to pay tax here. So the idea was that this would end the kind of inequity that we've seen in sharing of tax revenues. At the same time, it would at least reduce, if not completely end, the kind of race to the bottom that we've seen. Why will it not end the race to the bottom? Because all that the agreement says is that you have a minimum 15% tax. So companies, could go up to 15, but not below that. So it could be 15, 20, etc., depending on what each country decides, because after all, taxation is a sovereign right. So each
Yeah.
country can decide what they wish to do. So that really was this landmark agreement that was signed in Rome. And this was really landmark because this is something that the OECD had been working on for so many years and it hadn't been reached any kind of conclusion. The agreement is to come into effect in 2023, after which large firms, particularly tech multinationals, will not be able to book profits in these low tax jurisdictions. And countries like India, which have been denied tax revenues, will be able to get their hopefully due share of revenue. So that really is the significance of the G20 corporate tax agreement that was just signed in Rome by the leaders of the G20.
So, what explains your skepticism about this? Why are you so skeptical?
Yeah, I'm afraid I am skeptical. Partly, I suppose, being a journalist makes all of us skeptical because we've seen so many promises being made and then not being carried out. But also, multilateralism, G20 is all about multilateralism. And as
Yeah.
we've seen, multilateralism is a term that, everybody likes to bandy about. But when push comes to shove, it always becomes each country to itself. So we saw, the G20 itself. When did it really pick up steam? It was after the global financial crisis in
Yeah.
2008, when the US under President Bush realized that it can't really walk alone. Its financial sector and the economy was in such doldrums that it really
Yeah.
needed the support of the rest of the world. The rest of the world is normally looked down upon, as it were, because the US is really numero uno, politically, economically, whichever which way you want to say. But in 2008, when the US financial sector and the economy really capsized, the US realized that it need the rest of the world. So that was when, in fact, the G20 the level was elevated from that of just finance ministers to the global leaders. So they said not only must global leaders come for this annual summit, there should be an annual summit to which all leaders come. And for the first time in 2009, after the global financial crisis, we actually saw two summits happen and concrete plans were drawn up to bail
Yeah.
out essentially the US economy. But after the US economy really recovered in 2010, the G20 really went back to being a talk shop. You had as a photo opportunity for all the global leaders. Everybody would come to wherever the summit was being held, and they would have make these noises. So you saw the similar, the same kind of words were bandied about: environment, climate change, women's empowerment, gender equality, multilateralism, global trade. But really, very little was actually done. So, if you look at the communiques that were issued at the end of each summit, whether it was in Brisbane, whether it was in Las Cabas in Mexico, it really didn't matter. They were not basically empty words. Because if you look at it, the one occasion when the G20 could really have delivered post 2008 was during the pandemic year. When in November 2020, when we had the G20 summit in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, which was, of course, held as a virtual summit because it was obviously not possible for the global leaders to travel. But
Yeah.
even then, throughout the pandemic year, we really didn't see much movement in terms of global cooperation. In fact, what did we see? It became each country for itself. Countries closed their borders. In fact, you had countries like Australia and New Zealand, which completely shut their borders, not only to
True.
people from other countries, but even to their own citizens who were outside their borders. So it was
Yeah.
each country for itself, whether in terms of closing their borders, whether it was in terms of making vaccine availability. So all this talk of equality, about multilateralism, about watching out for each other was all forgotten about. So the G20 really has not been a very effective, you know, podium or a more forum to ensure that the things that they talk about, these grandiose statements that they make, are actually implemented. Now, let me come to the corporate tax agreement and why am I skeptical about this? To signed in Rome, of course, with a great deal of fanfare, but if you look at the final communique, there's only one paragraph that is devoted to this global tax agreement. And in fact, much more is time and energy has been devoted in terms of space also in the communique to climate change. Not that
Yeah.
climate change is less important, But climate change, we're going to have the COP meeting in Glasgow soon after.
Yeah.
And though the G20 would have a voice there, you would think that, they would have written much more about the global corporate tax agreement. But instead, they do say, in fact, it talks about two pillars. The first pillar was about the minimum tax, and the second pillar was about distribution of tax. So effectively, the G20 has not been able to really drive because it doesn't have teeth. And why does it not have teeth? And why did it have teeth in 2008? Essentially, to my mind, when I look at all the communiques issued after the G20 meets, the main difference to my mind is that in 2008, the US was interested. The US had a very vested and deep interest in ensuring that the G20 went together. Whereas now, if we look at the global tax agreement, you will find that many of the so called tax havens, many of the subterfuges that companies really adopt to avoid paying tax, these tax havens are located onshore in the US. In fact, ironically, in Wilmington, Delaware, which is actually the home of the US President, Joe Biden. So you have places in Wilmington. There is a building in Wilmington which has as many as 300,000 businesses, all registered in one building. So clearly, these are tax havens. Similarly, in the case of the UK, you have the Crown territories, the overseas territories of the UK,
Yeah.
like Jersey, Guernsey, etc., which are essentially tax havens. So the UK and the US, I'm not very sure they really mean to crack down on the tax havens from which they derive enormous benefit. And until you get these advanced countries to really sign into this kind of deal and actually act upon ending this kind of tax evasion, I'm not sure we'll be able to get very far. The only thing is that since the G20 is what I say a talk shop, at least leaders come together, they try to talk. You hope that over a period of time, as we've seen with trade, as now we're seeing some traction in climate change, if countries keep talking to each other rather than coming to blows and coming at, being at odds with each other, sometime, if not in 2023, which is the deadline for this corporate tax agreement, we will see some kind of result. And that will really help countries like India, which, as you know, because of our large domestic market, every tech giant wants to have a
Who wants
presence
to
here.
be here?
But the presence is only in terms of doing business as far as selling things is concerned, as far as getting customers is concerned. When it comes to paying tax, it's a different story altogether. We do not want to pay tax in India. So you're enjoying all the benefits of our markets, but you don't want to pay tax. So this is what we hope at some time in the future, if not in 2023, in December 22, mind you, we take on the presidency of the G20. So we can
Yeah.
try and push. But as I said, since in the global economic global economy, unfortunately, India is still a pipsqueak. We
Yeah.
haven't got there yet. We're nowhere near China, certainly nowhere near the US. But someday we hope to get there. And as we get more and more prosperous with each successive day, and as our population becomes large enough and rich enough for companies also to take what we say seriously, hopefully we will be able to push at least and ensure that this global tax agreement that has been signed with so much fanfare does deliver something to countries like us.
So, what stops India from becoming, say, a tax haven? Why don't we say declare Karnataka a tax haven, or maybe Andaman's a tax haven? What stops us?
Well, what stops us simply because we believe in playing by the rules, I would say. I think India has
Good.
always believed in multilateralism. If you see, and we realize that since we're not a global economic power, ultimately our strength lies in multilateralism. So wherever you see, that is why we've really not gone the bilateral way. Even if you see in trade agreements, India has eschewed the bilateral trade route. Yes, we do have some free trade agreements with a number of countries, and as more and more countries go into bilateral trade agreements, India has also gone along in many cases. But we realize that almost any other country, whether it is the US, whether it is the UK or the EU, these are much larger economic powers than us. So our bargaining position in a bilateral forum is much more limited than in a multilateral forum. In a multilateral forum, which is really a true democracy, which is why the advanced countries don't like it, because they find that suddenly you have to listen to every country in the world, regardless of how small they are. So the
Yeah.
multilateral forum doesn't really suit the advanced countries. They prefer multilateral forum like the IMF, like the World Bank, where their voice
Mhm.
counts for much more, whereas India always prefers a multilateral forum. So, having said that we want the multilateral forum, we believe in playing by the rules of the game, I don't think India would ever seriously think in terms of offering tax havens. Because let's also
Mhm.
not forget that when the moment you have a tax haven, you also have a lot of undesirable activities happening in these places. So I don't
Mhm.
think, fortunately, I think a country like ours does not want to go that way. We want to play by the rules of the game. We believe in multilateralism. So we believe that a corporate tax agreement where everybody plays by the rules of the game is something that is much better for every country in the world, including India.
But do you think an Indian tax haven would draw a lot of international uh, attention? It would be attractive, do you think?
No, as I said, since India is not even going to, I don't think India's ever thought of having a tax haven within its shores. Because, as I said, we've always believed that there is no need to do that. We have a large enough market, and if we start prospering, as we already are prospering, we are far, far better off than we were even 20, 30 years ago. So, when
Hmm.
we have this large market, which is not just large in terms of number of people, but also in terms of the economic purchasing power that the people possess, then companies will
Mhm.
automatically come here. You don't have to offer them tax havens. If you've seen the FDI, the foreign direct investment flows that we've attracted in the past 1 or 2 years, you will see that it's not necessary for you to have a tax haven. All that is necessary for you is to make it easy for companies to do business in India. So I think that's
Mhm.
what the attempt in India should always be, to reduce the red tape, to make it easy to companies to do business in India, reduce corruption, which I'm afraid unfortunately is part of our landscape. And if you
Yes.
do things like that, you will get companies coming into India. And one major factor that I think will play to our advantage at this juncture is the fact that many countries in the world, many companies in the world are now getting disenchanted with China.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, they have not moved to India as much as we had hoped for. They've gone to countries like Vietnam, to Thailand, even to Bangladesh, and they have not come as much to India. But thanks to the concerted efforts by government, whether it is the Make in India or the PLI scheme or the numerous subsidies that we have been offering, two companies who set up shop in India. These companies will come and countries will start looking at India as a country which is a democracy, so which does not take arbitrary autocratic decisions. It is not
Mhm.
that a company is here in India today and is asked to go out tomorrow. If even countries like we saw, companies like Vodafone, which had a grouse with the government of India,
Yeah, yeah.
could go to court and could win in the Supreme Court. So these are very reassuring signs, which I think companies all over the world are now realizing matter much more than to just be in China, for instance. One, you're there for 2 years, 3 years, you don't know what's going to happen in the fourth year.
Mm.
You could suddenly be asked to go. So in India, it is difficult to start doing business. It is difficult to do business in India. I concede all of that. But once you establish shop in India, the classic example being Suzuki. India is now
Mm.
the largest market for Suzuki. It is the largest profit center. And
Yeah.
Maruti still has a dominant share in the Indian auto market. So I think these are the kind of signals that change in India happens slowly, but when it happens, there is no abrupt reversal. The pace of change can vary, but you will not have an about turn, a kind of 360-degree change that you've seen in the case of, say, China.
Mhm. So do you assume now that given this G20 announcement, declaration, whatever, the e-commerce firms will start cleaning up their act? Do we now have an instrument to tell them that you have to shape up or ship out?
Well, I don't think we really have the clout to tell them ship out. So, because as I said, now we are, even though there has been so many moves again, globalization, the fact is that we are all part of the global value chain, and
Yeah.
globalization is a reality. So, I think what will happen is that these e commerce firms will realize that their days of you doing this kind of tax evasion, tax subterfuge, etc., are coming to an end. So it is better to kind of cooperate and better to kind of start reducing their efforts to pass on their tax, book their profits in other jurisdictions. And hopefully, it'll also help that we can tell them that, look, if you comply, if you're willing to go along with what the terms of this corporate tax agreement will say, then we can remove the digital tax, we can remove other unilateral measures that we have been forced to impose. Like we have something known as an equalization levy that was introduced in 2016. And this
Yeah.
was really aimed at taxing foreign firms that have a substantial client base in India who do not pay commensurately, anything remotely commensurately when it comes to tax. So we could tell companies, that e-commerce companies, tech giants, that look, it is win-win for all of us. It cannot be only one way. We will
Yes.
be able to remove these equalization levies, remove the digital tax, and in return, you must pay the tax revenues that you are due to us. You are functioning in our jurisdiction. You are benefiting from our populations, law and order, whatever the public goods that all these companies enjoy. And we've seen that they do. Such large share of their business comes from India. So it is only fair that you should start paying tax, and hopefully companies will also read the writing on the wall, and we will have better compliance, not complete compliance, but better compliance. But it's all part of a journey.
Well, amen to that. Mythili Bhusnurmath, pleasure talking to you. Glad we got some of those details right. There's been a lot of confusion on that. Thanks very much, and we'll hope to keep the conversation continuing.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And for all of you out there who are following us on YouTube, come to our website, subscribe to our YouTube channel, keep coming to us with your comments and observations. And thank you very much. Good night.